The smell of burnt coffee always took her back to that morning. Helen closed her eyes, letting the memory engulf her like thick smoke, her hands trembling imperceptibly as she held the mug. 22 years. 22 years since she'd made the only choice possible, and yet the acrid scent of poorly brewed coffee could still transform her quiet kitchen into a trap of memories. The librarian she had become, organized, meticulous, invisible, disappeared in these moments, giving way to the desperate woman who once packed her entire life into a small suitcase and fled in the middle of the night with a 5-year-old boy in her arms. The library bell rang with its familiar cadence, but Helen didn't move immediately. She was lost in the sound of Caius's heavy breathing that distant night as he slept against her chest in the back seat of the bus that would take them far from everything they knew. He'd asked about his father only once during the journey, and she'd lied, a necessary lie, painful as swallowed glass, but necessary. "Daddy had to stay," she'd whispered, kissing her son's dark hair. "But we'll be okay. We'll always be okay together." The second chime of the bell brought her back to the present. Helen placed the mug on the table with excessive care, as if the slightest noise could shatter the fragile equilibrium she'd built over 2 decades. Her footsteps on the wooden floor of the library echoed in the Tuesday afternoon silence, a sound that usually soothed her but today seemed amplified, almost menacing. The winter sun filtered through the tall windows, creating geometric patterns on the dusty shelves, and for a moment she had the inexplicable feeling of being watched. At the entrance, a middle-aged man idly flipped through an old magazine. There was something familiar about his movements, the way his fingers drummed on the cover, but Helen couldn't place it. He looked up as she approached, and she saw something that made her hesitate, an instant recognition, as if he knew exactly who she was, while she struggled to fit his face into any corner of her memory. "Can I help you?" Her voice came, out lower than she intended, laden with a caution she couldn't disguise. The man smiled, but there was something forced about it, as if he were acting a poorly rehearsed part. "I'm looking for information on the town's history," he said, and Helen noticed his eyes didn't match his words. They studied her with an intensity that made her take a half step back. "Especially about families who moved here in the last 20 years. It's for genealogical research." Helen's heart beat faster, but she kept her expression neutral. 20 years. The coincidence was too great to ignore, but maybe it was just paranoia. A ghost she'd carried for so long that she now saw threats where there was only innocent curiosity. "We have some files in the local history section," she replied, indicating a shelf at the back of the library. "But most family records are at the courthouse." The man nodded but didn't move. Instead, he continued to observe her with those eyes that seemed to know secrets she'd buried deep. "Have you lived here long?" he asked, and Helen felt a shiver run down her spine. The question was too casual, too rehearsed. "A few years," she lied without hesitation, a lie that had become automatic over time. "Excuse me, I need to organize some returns." She moved away before he could ask more questions, but felt his eyes burning into her back as she walked toward the counter. Her hands trembled as she opened the register book, and she had to take a deep breath to control the anxiety rising in. Her throat like bile. He was just a researcher, she told herself, just a man curious about local history. There was no reason for the panic that was settling in her chest like a hungry beast. But when she looked back, he had disappeared. The magazine lay on the table where he'd been sitting, open to a page showing old photos of the town. Helen approached cautiously, as if the publication might explode at any moment, and saw that one of the photos had been circled in red ink. It was a picture from the school music festival where Caius worked, taken the previous year. In the center of the photo, Her son smiled as he conducted a children's choir, completely unaware that this seemingly innocent image had become part of something far more sinister. Helen slammed the magazine shut, but her hands still trembled. The man knew. Somehow he knew who she was, who Caius was, and what they had fled so long ago. The sense of security she had meticulously built over more than 2 decades began to unravel like torn fabric, revealing the raw terror she had never truly overcome. She closed the library early that day, something she'd never done in 5 years of working there. The way home seemed endless, every shadow a potential threat, every noise a confirmation of her worst fears. The small, modest house she shared with Caius had been strategically chosen, on a quiet street, with good visibility, 2 possible exits. Helen had spent years planning escape routes she hoped she'd never need to use, but now every detail of that planning returned to her mind with painful clarity. Caius arrived shortly after her, carrying sheet music and the guitar that never left his side. At 27, he had become the man she had always hoped he would be, kind, talented, loved by everyone who knew him. Helen looked at her son, her treasure, her reason for being, and knew she could no longer protect him from the truth. Not completely. "Caius," she began, but the words refused to come. How to explain a lifetime of necessary lies? How to tell a grown man that he'd spent his entire life running from a ghost she'd created? The phone rang before she could continue. 1 ring, 2, 3. Helen stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake, her heart pounding so hard she was sure Caius could hear it. No one called them. No one had that number. It was one of the rules she'd established. Unlisted numbers, few contacts, a discreet life. "Aren't you going to answer?" Caius asked, but Helen shook her head. The phone stopped ringing, and the silence that followed was worse than the sound. Then it began again. 1 ring, 2, 3, insistent, determined. Helen rose with trembling legs and answered. "Hello?" Silence on the other end, but she could hear breathing, slow, deliberate, familiar in a way that made her nauseous. Then a voice she hadn't heard in over 2 decades, but recognized instantly, "Elisa!" She hung up immediately, but her hands were shaking so badly that she dropped the phone. Caius rose in alarm, but Helen was lost in a wave of panic that swept her back to that house, those screams, those nights she slept with a packed suitcase under the bed, always ready to run. "Mom!" Caius grabbed her shoulders. "What's happening? Who was that?" Helen looked at her son and saw confusion, fear, but also determination. He wasn't the 5-year-old boy she'd carried away from danger anymore. He was a man, and he deserved the truth, however painful. "We need to leave," she said, surprising herself with the firmness of her own voice. "Now. We need to leave. Now." "What? Mom, you're scaring me." "Your name isn't Caius." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "Your name is Arthur, and the man who just called is your father." The silence that followed was deafening. Caius, Arthur, stared at her as if she were a stranger, and maybe she was. Maybe the woman he knew as his mother was just an elaborate lie, a performance she'd perfected over decades. "My father is dead," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "You told me he died before I was born." "I lied." The words came out as a confession, laden with 22 years of guilt and necessity. "I lied because it was the only way to protect you." The phone rang again. This time, Caius answered before Helen could stop him. "Hello?" His voice was cautious but firm. Helen watched his expression change, first confusion, then shock, then something she couldn't identify. "Who is this?" he asked, and Helen knew. Mauro was on the other end, with his persuasive voice, his convincing half-truths. She snatched the phone from her son's hand and hung up again, but it was too late. She saw in Caius's eyes that something had irrevocably changed. "He said he's my father," Caius murmured. "He said you kidnapped me. I saved you." Helen's voice was louder than she intended, laden with the pain she'd carried alone for so long. "I saved you from him." "Saved me from what?" Helen closed her eyes and let the memories flood back all at once like a broken dam. Mauro shouting in the middle of the night, the neighbors pretending not to hear, hands too large for little Arthur's body, the uncontrolled rage that transformed the man she once loved into something unrecognizable. The day he hit the boy for the first time, and she knew there was no turning back. "He was violent," she said, opening her eyes to meet her son's gaze. "With me, with you, I tried. God knows I tried to make it work. But when he raised his hand to you..." Her voice failed, but she forced herself to continue. "I couldn't let you grow up afraid. I couldn't let you become like him." Caius recoiled as if she'd struck him. "You lied to me my whole life. I protected you. With lies. With what I had," Helen shouted, and the pain in her voice echoed through the small house. "I did what any mother would do. I chose you above all else, above my own identity, my family, my life. I chose you." Caius stepped back, running a hand through his hair, trying to process information that shattered everything he thought he knew about himself. I need air," he murmured, heading for the door. "I need to think." "Don't go," Helen pleaded. "Please, Caius. Arthur, don't go. He's here. He found us." But her son was already gone, leaving Helen alone with her fears and the terrifying certainty that everything was falling apart. She moved automatically, checking locks, closing curtains, preparing for a siege she dreaded for over 2 decades. Her hands found the suitcase she kept hidden in the bedroom closet, still packed after all these years, still ready for an escape she'd hoped she'd never need to make. Outside, night had fallen with unusual darkness. Helen switched off the house lights and positioned herself at the front window, watching the street through a crack in the curtain. At first, she saw nothing but the familiar shadows of the quiet neighborhood. Then a figure moved beneath the streetlight on the corner, a tall man, broad-shouldered, waiting with the patience of a predator. Mauro. Even from a distance, even after so many years, she recognized him. The posture, the way he stood, the sense of threat that radiated from him like heat. He'd found their address, likely following Caius home. How many days had he watched them? How many nights had he waited in the darkness, planning this moment? Helen felt panic rising in her throat, but forced herself to think clearly. Caius had left on foot, probably for the park he used to go to when he needed to think. If Mauro found him alone, confused, vulnerable, she couldn't let that happen. Not after sacrificing everything to avoid this precise moment. She grabbed her car keys and the suitcase, but hesitated at the door. Leaving meant confronting the man who had haunted her nightmares for 2 decades. Staying meant leaving Caius alone and unprotected in a city she'd thought was safe. There was no good choice, only varying degrees of danger. The decision was made for her when she saw a second figure join the first one under the streetlight. Even in the darkness, Helen recognized her son's silhouette. Caius had returned, but he wasn't alone. Mauro had finally gotten what he wanted, a face-to-face meeting with the son he'd been searching for all these years. Helen slipped out the back door, using the intimate knowledge of the neighborhood she'd acquired over the years. Every garden, every shortcut, every possible hiding place was mapped in her mind. She moved through the shadows like a ghost, approaching the corner where father and son were meeting for the first time in over 2 decades. Their voices reached her. Before she could see them clearly, Mauro's voice, deeper than she remembered, but with the same persuasive cadence that had once convinced her he could change. "You look just like me when I was your age. It's amazing how genetics work, isn't it?" Why? Caius's voice was thick with emotion. Why did she do this? Why lie about you being dead? Helen hid behind a tree, close enough to hear, far enough away not to be seen. Her heart pounded so hard she was sure they could hear it. But neither man seemed to notice her presence. Your mother was always unstable, Mauro said, and Helen recognized the subtle manipulation in his voice. She had problems, Arthur, paranoia, depression. I tried to help, but she was convinced I was a threat to you. She created stories in her head, lies she started to believe were true. What kind of stories? Helen closed her eyes, knowing what was coming next. Mauro had always been a master of rewriting history, of turning his violence into concern, his rage into misunderstood love. She said I was violent, that I hurt you both. But I never... Arthur, I may have been a flawed father, but I never hurt you. I loved you too much for that. Silence stretched between them, and Helen felt her world unraveling. She knew how convincing Mauro could be, how his words could sound reasonable, especially to someone who desperately wanted to believe he'd been loved by a father he'd never known. Then why would she run away? Caius finally asked. Why destroy our lives if there was no reason? Because she was sick, son, and because... Mauro hesitated as if struggling with a painful truth. Because there was another man. She wanted a new life, and you and I were obstacles to that. Helen had to cover her mouth to stop herself from screaming. It was a lie so elaborate, so cruelly constructed, that for a moment she almost doubted her own memories. There had never been another man. There had only been fear and the desperate need to protect her son from a man who saw violence as an acceptable form of love. That doesn't make sense, Caius said, but his voice was less certain than before. There was never anyone. Never. Of course there wasn't anyone after, Mauro replied smoothly, because she knew what she did was wrong. She knew she stole me from you, stole you from me. The guilt must have eaten away at her all these years. Helen saw Caius run a hand through his hair again, a gesture she recognized as a sign of extreme confusion. Her boy, because he was still her boy despite everything, was being manipulated by the same man who had once convinced her that her bruises were accidents, that her screams were justified, that love could hurt and still be love. I want to hear her side, Caius said finally. I want to hear her story. Of course, Mauro agreed readily. It's only fair. You deserve to hear both sides. He paused, and Helen saw the smile creep onto his face. Not the warm smile he wore in public, but the other one, the one she'd learned to fear. In fact, she's probably watching us right now. Elisa always was vigilant. Helen felt her blood run cold. How did he know? How did he always know? Elisa, Mauro called out, his voice echoing in the quiet street. I know you're there. Why don't you come out and explain to our son why you destroyed our family? For a moment, Helen considered staying hidden, pretending he was wrong. But then she saw the expression on Caius's face. Confusion, pain, a desperate need for answers. And knew she couldn't leave him alone with Mauro's lies for another second. She stepped out of the shadows slowly, her legs trembling, but her resolve firm. Hello, Mauro, she said, surprising herself with the calmness of her own voice. Still spinning tales, I see. Mauro's smile widened when he saw her. Elisa, you look different. Older, of course, but still recognizable. Still the woman who made me search for you for 22 years. You didn't search for us out of love, Helen said, keeping her voice low but steady. You searched for us out of possession, because you can't accept that anyone can escape your control. Mom, Caius started, but Helen raised her hand. Let me speak, she said, never taking her eyes off Mauro. Let me tell him about the first time you hit me. I was 6 months pregnant, And you said it was because I'd questioned where you'd been late. Remember, Mauro? Remember how you cried afterward? How you swore it would never happen again?" Mauro's smile faltered slightly. "You're twisting. Let me tell him about the first time you raised your hand to him," Helen continued, gesturing to Caius. "He was 4 years old and spilled juice on your newspaper. You grabbed him by the arm so hard you left marks that lasted a week. And when I protested, you said you were teaching him discipline. That never happened," Mauro said, but his voice was less certain now. "It did," Helen responded firmly, "and it happened again, many times, until the day I said enough." Caius looked from one to the other, his face a map of conflicting emotions. Helen could see he wanted to believe her, but she also saw the seduction of Mauro's words, the promise of a father who loved him, of a story where he had been wanted instead of protected. "Arthur," Mauro said softly, "look at me. I'm your father. You can see that, can't you? You have my eyes, my jawline. We're family, and family doesn't abandon family. A family doesn't hurt family," Helen countered, "and family doesn't stalk family for 2 decades. "I didn't stalk," Mauro said, and now his voice had an edge of irritation that Helen recognized as the precursor to his rage. "I searched. There's a difference. I searched for the son who was stolen from me by a woman who what?" Helen challenged him. "Who left you? Who chose the safety of her own child over your need for control?" The shift in Mauro was almost instantaneous. The smile vanished, replaced by the expression Helen remembered from the worst moments of their marriage. Cold, calculating, dangerous. "Careful, Elisa," he said softly. "Careful what you say in front of our son." "It's not us," Helen replied, stepping forward despite the fear rising in her throat. "It was never us. It was you, and us trying to survive you." It was then that Mauro moved, faster than Helen remembered, faster than she was prepared to face. His hand closed around her wrist with enough force to cut off the circulation, and she was instantly transported back to that house, those moments of pure terror when her survival depended on saying the right words, on keeping calm, on not provoking. The beast that lived inside the man who had promised to love her. "Stop," Caius said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Let her go." Mauro looked at his son, and Helen saw something pass between them, a mutual recognition perhaps, or the weight of 2 decades of absence condensing into a single moment. "Arthur," he said without releasing Helen's wrist, "you don't understand. I said, let her go." Caius's voice was firmer now, charged with an authority Helen had never heard before. Now. For a moment, Helen thought Mauro would disobey, would turn the situation into a physical display of the power he had always wielded through violence. But then he released her wrist so abruptly that she stumbled backward. "You see?" Mauro said, turning to Caius with his arms outstretched in a parody of innocence. "You see how she provokes me? How she twists everything to make it seem like I'm the villain?" But Caius wasn't looking at Helen. He was looking at the red marks on her wrist, at the way she rubbed the spot where Mauro had held her. And Helen saw in her son's face the exact moment the truth settled in, not the words that had been spoken, but the physical reality of what he had just witnessed. "Jesus," Caius murmured. "You really did that, didn't you? You really hit her." "He hit me." "Arthur, you don't understand." "My name is Caius." The correction was firm, final. "My name is Caius, and I understand perfectly." The ensuing silence was thick with 22 years of unspoken truths. Helen saw in Mauro's face the moment he realized he'd lost, that his carefully chosen words, his convincing half-truths, couldn't compete with the physical evidence of who he truly was. "You two are alike," Mauro finally said, his voice laced with a bitterness Helen remembered well. "Always conspiring against me, always making me look like the villain." "We didn't need to make you look like anything," Helen replied. "You did," That all on your own. It was then that Mauro laughed, a sound that had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with the final shattering of any mask of normalcy he'd maintained. You think you can just, what? Pretend I don't exist? Carry on with your perfect lives built on lies. They're not lies, Caius said. It's survival. Survival? Mauro repeated, and now his voice had the dangerous quality Helen remembered. From the moments preceding violence, I'll show you what survival is. He moved again, but this time not toward Helen, toward Caius. And Helen saw in Mauro's eyes the same blind fury that had once made her fear for her son's life, the same need for domination that couldn't accept challenge or disobedience. But Caius was no longer a 5-year-old boy. He moved out of Mauro's reach with reflexes Helen didn't know he possessed, keeping a safe distance while assessing the situation. "No," he said simply. "I'm not going to let you do that again." "Do what?" Mauro asked, but his posture betrayed his intentions. "Get my son back, get my family back." We were never your family," Helen said, finding courage from a source she didn't know existed. "We were your possessions, and possessions don't get a say." Mauro turned to her with a speed that made her instinctively recoil. 22 years, he said, his voice low and dangerous. 22 years searching for you. Do you have any idea what that's done to me? What it's cost? "No more than it cost us," Helen replied. "No more than a lifetime of looking over our shoulders, of teaching a child to fear his own name, of—" She didn't finish the sentence because Mauro moved again, faster this time, his hands finding her throat before she could pull away. The grip was familiar, not strong enough to cause real damage, but firm enough to be a clear threat, a display of power she'd experienced many times before. "You destroyed my life," he whispered against her ear, and Helen smelled his breath, the same one that haunted her nightmares. "You stole my son from me and forced me to live like a ghost. You're going to pay for that. Get your hands off her." Caius's voice came from somewhere to the right, laced with a coldness Helen had never heard before. "Now." Mauro laughed, without releasing Helen. "Or what? You're going to stop me? You're going to hurt your own father?" "If I have to." The simplicity of the answer, the absolute certainty in Caius's voice, made Mauro hesitate. Helen felt the grip on her throat loosen slightly, and she took the opportunity to pull away, her hands instinctively going to her aching neck. "You don't understand," Mauro said, turning to Caius with an expression that mixed desperation and fury. "I'm your father, your blood. You can't just discard me like I'm nothing." "Being a father isn't about blood," Caius replied, keeping a safe distance but not backing down. "It's about protection. It's about love that doesn't hurt. It's about being present in ways that matter. I was present. I searched. For you, for—" "You searched out of possession," Caius interrupted. "Not for me, for control, for some version of me that only exists in your head." Helen saw something break in Mauro's face, the last pretense that this was about paternal love, that 22 years of obsession had been driven by something noble. What remained was more honest and infinitely more dangerous. Pure rage, a need for domination, the resentment of a man who had never accepted that he couldn't control other human beings through force. "Fine," he said, his voice taking on an almost conversational quality that Helen recognized as the prelude to his most violent moments. "Fine, if you want to do this the hard way." He moved toward Caius again, but this time Helen was ready. She placed herself between them, small against Mauro's bulk, but firm in a way she hadn't been in 2 decades. "No," she said simply. "You're not going to touch him. Get out of the way, Elisa. My name is Helen." The correction came out stronger than she expected. "Elisa died the night I took my son and ran from you. Helen is who I became. Helen is who he knows as his mother." Mauro shoved her hard enough to make her stumble, but she didn't fall. Instead, she remained between him and Caius, a human barrier protecting her son the way she should have years ago, when she was too young and too frightened to understand that some battles were worth fighting. "You want to hurt me?" she asked, looking directly into Mauro's eyes. "Then hurt me, but you're not going to touch him, not while I'm breathing." For a moment, Helen thought Mauro would accept the challenge, that he would turn the quiet street into a stage for the violence that had defined their relationship so many years before. But then she saw something different in his eyes, not just anger, but also recognition. Recognition that the woman before him was no longer the young, terrified Elisa he had intimidated years ago. This was someone forged by 2 decades of maternal protection, someone who had found strength in the necessity of keeping another human being safe. "You've changed," he said, almost admiringly. "I had to change," Helen replied. "You forced me to change." "And you think that makes you strong?" Mauro laughed, but there was something strained in the sound. "You think running away and hiding for 20 years makes you a heroine?" "It makes me a mother," Helen said simply. "Something you never understood." That's when they heard it. Footsteps approaching, more than one person. Helen turned and saw 2 police officers walking toward them, likely drawn by the shouts she hadn't realized they were making. For a moment, she felt pure relief, authority, protection, the possibility that this nightmare could have an official end. But then she saw the expression on Mauro's face and knew he wouldn't go quietly. There was something in his eyes she recognized from the worst moments of their marriage, the determination of a man who would rather destroy everything than accept defeat. "Officers," Mauro said, his voice instantly assuming the respectful, controlled tone he always used with authority figures. "Good of you to arrive. This woman kidnapped my son 22 years ago. I finally found them." Helen felt the world tilt beneath her feet. This was what she had feared for decades, not just the confrontation with Mauro, but the possibility that her necessary lies would be exposed in a context where the truth was more complicated than the law could understand. How could she explain to strangers that she had kidnapped her own son to save him? How could she make police officers understand that sometimes escape is the only form of protection? "Is that true?" one of the officers asked, looking at Helen. With a mixture of professionalism and suspicion, Helen opened her mouth, but no words came out. How could she summarize 2 decades of fear, protection, and love in an answer that would make sense to strangers? How could she explain that, yes, technically she had kidnapped her own son, but it was the only right thing to do? "Mom," Caius said softly, putting a hand on her shoulder. Then, turning to the officers, "My name is Caius Almeida. I'm 27 years old. This is my mother, Helen. And this man," he pointed to Mauro, "may be my biological father, but he threatened us just minutes ago. You can see the marks on her neck." The officers looked at Helen, noticing for the first time the red marks that were beginning to darken. One of them approached Mauro. "Sir, I'm going to need you to keep your distance from the lady and the young man." "They're my family," Mauro protested, but his voice had lost some of its previous confidence. "I have rights." "You have the right to an attorney," the officer replied dryly, "but you don't have the right to assault anyone, family or not." Helen saw Mauro assess the situation. 2 officers, witnesses, physical evidence of assault. For the first time since they had reunited, he seemed uncertain, as if he was finally realizing that the control he had exerted over her decades ago didn't extend to the real world. "Do you want to press charges?" the second officer asked Helen. And Caius? Helen looked at her son, seeing in him the same doubt she felt. Pressing charges would mean exposure, investigation, the possibility that the whole truth about the past 22 years would come to light. But not pressing charges meant leaving Mauro free to continue the pursuit, to find other ways to exert control over their lives. "Yes," Caius said before Helen could answer. "We do." "No," Mauro said, his voice taking on a tone of desperation Helen had never heard before. "Caius, you don't understand. You're my son, my only son. I lost 22 years of your life. I can't lose anymore." "My name is Caius," he repeated patiently. "And you didn't lose anything. You wasted it. There were choices to be made, and you chose violence. You chose control. You chose to be someone we needed to run from." The officers began to lead Mauro to the patrol car, but he resisted, turning one last time to Helen. "This isn't over," he said, and there was a sinister promise in his voice. "You can hide behind the police, behind the laws, but this isn't over. He's my son, and I will." "Will what?" Helen asked, finding a voice she didn't know she possessed. "Will you stalk me for another 20 years? Will you waste the rest of your life on an obsession that has never brought anything but pain?" Mauro stared at her for a long moment, and Helen saw in him something that might have been sadness if it weren't so mixed with rage. "You took everything from me," he said finally. "I saved myself," she replied. "And I saved our son. And if you can't see the difference, then you never understood what you lost." The officers finally managed to get Mauro into the patrol car, but his eyes remained fixed on Helen and Caius until the car disappeared into the darkness of the night. Only then did Helen allow her legs to tremble, allowing the adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation to finally dissipate. "Are you okay?" Caius asked, putting his arm around her shoulders. Helen looked at her son, her boy, her treasure, the courageous man he had become despite everything, and felt a wave of emotion so intense it almost knocked her down. "I am," she said, and for the first time in 22 years she truly believed it. They walked home in silence, each lost in thoughts that were too heavy for words. The small house that had been their refuge for 5 years felt different now. No longer a hiding place, but simply home. The secret that had defined their lives for so long was finally out in the open, exposed to the light, but not destroyed by it. In the kitchen, Helen made tea with hands that still trembled slightly. Caius sat at the table, watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he finally asked. Helen turned to him, holding the warm mug like an anchor. "Because you were a child, because I thought it would be easier for you to grow up thinking your father had died than to know he was someone we needed to run from. And then, when I grew up, then..." Helen sighed, sitting in the chair beside him. "Then I was afraid you'd hate me, that you'd discover I'd lied about something so fundamental and decide I was no better than him." Caius was silent for a long time, swirling his tea in his cup. "I don't hate you," he finally said. "I'm confused, hurt, angry that I found out this way, but I don't hate you." "And what about him?" Helen asked, the question she dreaded asking. "How do you feel about him?" Caius thought before answering. "Sad," he eventually said. "Sad for what he could have been and chose not to be. Sad for the opportunities he wasted, but not... I don't feel like I lost a father, because I never had a father to lose." Helen felt tears burning her eyes. "I'm so sorry. For all the lies, for all the times you asked and I didn't know what to say. I'm so sorry for..." "Stop," Caius said softly, reaching out to take her hand. "Stop apologizing for protecting me. Stop apologizing for doing the hardest thing a mother can do. It was the only thing I could do. It was the right thing to do." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, processing events that had changed everything in a matter of hours. Helen knew there would be more conversations, more questions, more emotional work to be done. But for the first time in decades, she felt they could face whatever came next, together. "What happens now?" Caius eventually asked. Helen looked around the kitchen, The plants she'd lovingly cared for, the photos of Caius at various ages, the small treasures they'd accumulated, building a life together. Now we live, she said. Really live, without looking over our shoulders, without fear of the past. We live. And him? Mauro? Helen considered the question, the complexity of a situation that didn't have easy resolutions. He'll have to find his own way to live with the choices he made. We're not responsible for that anymore. Caius nodded, looking older than his 27 years, but also lighter in some indefinable way. Helen, he said, using her chosen name for the first time. Thank you. For what? For saving me. For giving me a life where I didn't have to be afraid. For being my mother in all the ways that matter. Helen closed her eyes, letting the words settle into places in her soul that had remained sore for so long. When she opened them again, she saw Caius smiling, not the cautious smile she'd learned to recognize when he was worried about her, but something genuine and free. There's something I'd like to do, he said. What? I want to write a song about all of this. About difficult choices and protective love and about you. Helen felt her heart warm in a way she'd forgotten was possible. What will you call it? Caius smiled. Helen. It'll be called Helen. 3 months later, Helen sat in the front row of the school auditorium where Caius worked, listening to him perform his new composition for an audience of parents and students. The song told a story. Not all the details, but the essence of it. It spoke of protection and sacrifice, of love that sometimes demands impossible choices, of the courage it takes to start over. When the last note faded into the silence of the auditorium, Helen closed her eyes and let the tears come. They weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of release, of a weight finally lifted after decades of carrying it. Mauro had been prosecuted for assault and harassment, receiving a restraining order that prevented him from approaching them. Helen knew this didn't guarantee he'd give up completely, but it was a start. More importantly, she knew that she and Caius were no longer the same people who had fled in the dead of night so many years ago. They were stronger now, united not only by the shared secret, but by the truth finally revealed. After the performance, as they walked home under a starlit sky, Caius asked, "Do you ever think about what could have been if you hadn't run away?" Helen considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but then I look at you, at the man you've become, at the kind and strong person you managed to be despite everything, and I know I made the right choice. Even though it cost so much?" "Especially because it cost so much," Helen replied. "The best choices are rarely the easiest." They arrived home to find a letter in the mailbox. Helen recognized the handwriting immediately, and her first instinct was to throw it away unopened. But Caius intercepted it. "We can read it together," he suggested. "If it's threatening, we call the police. If it's something else, we deal with that too." The letter was short, written in a handwriting that had become more shaky with age. "Elisa and Arthur, I'm not going to look for you anymore. Not because I accept what you did, but because I finally understand that I can't force anyone to love me or forgive me. Caius became a good man. I can see that, even in the few minutes we spent together. Maybe you were right about me being a danger to him. Maybe I could never have given him what you gave him. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect a second chance. I just wanted you to know that I'll try to learn to live with the choices they made, just as you've learned to live with yours." Mauro Helen read the letter twice before handing it to Caius. When he finished, they sat in silence for a long moment. "What do you think?" Helen finally asked. "I think he finally understood something important," Caius replied. "I don't know if that changes anything for us, but maybe it's the start of something better for him." Helen nodded, tucking the letter into a drawer. Maybe one day it would mean something more, or maybe it was just another manipulative attempt by a man who had spent decades perfecting the art. Time would tell. But for now, it was enough to know that she and Caius had survived the confrontation she had dreaded for so long, and that they had emerged from it not only unscathed, but more united than ever. That night, Helen dreamed for the first time in years without nightmares. She dreamed of music, of the melody Caius had created in her honor, of the notes dancing in the air like promises of possible futures. When she woke the next morning, her first thought wasn't about Mauro or the past that had haunted her for so long. It was about fresh coffee and the sound of Caius playing guitar in the living room, about plans for the garden she wanted to plant in the spring, about the simple, precious life they had built together and that no one else could take from them. Helen got up, put on her robe and walked into the kitchen, where the smell of coffee, not burnt this time, but perfectly brewed, greeted her like a promise of normal mornings and fearless days. Through the window, she saw that it had begun to snow, delicate flakes transforming the familiar world into something new and beautiful. "Good morning, Mom," Caius said as she entered the living room without stopping playing. "Good morning, my love," she replied, and for the first time in 22 years, she truly believed it would be a good day. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the old footprints and creating a clean new world, full of possibilities they were finally free to explore.